Hey folks, and welcome to another episode of Hit Reviews with your host, Arlyeon. On today's episode, I'll be talking about Anima Projects action RPG, Anima, Gate of Memories. Find out if this bizarre fantasy managed to provide a memorable experience or feels ultimately forgettable. In a world that has been grievously threatened by supernatural entities, the shadowy organization of Nathaniel fights back against the darkness by using their own wicked machinations against them. Unfortunately, they're less than well equipped when one of their greatest agents goes rogue and chooses to steal an apocalyptic tome from their archives. With little time to spare, they task you, the bearer of calamities, to confront the traitor in hopes that they might be stopped. And, that's the basic premise of the game. But before I get into the deets of story elements and the like, I need to actually touch on a subject, and that's the calamity that you're bearing. The entity known as Ergo Mundus, who manages to alternate between being a complete ham, a chauvinistic creeper, and absolutely hilarious, oftentimes with whiplash-inducing speed. And as much as the game tries to build up a very anime-feeling tale of mystery, exploration, and the gradual unveiling of an arcane plot, the gravitas of the situation occasionally comes to a screeching halt as Ergo does what he does best, either leaning heavily on the fourth wall or lewdly commenting the bearer's assets in a way that made me cringe. That the protagonist handles all of this in a terse, deadpan stride didn't help either, as there were times I felt a cardboard cutout could have emoted more profoundly in a scene. And it's a shame, since it does detract a fair bit from the story at large. That's not to say that the overall arc is masterful or the like, but there's interesting bits of lore to uncover, both from talking to the NPCs to your companion, Ergo, when you're resting at the hub, as well as bits of boss backstory. The lattermost was perhaps the most interesting element to me, since you were actually obliged to hunt down at least 3 out of 5 of these to unlock the ability to confront the bosses, giving some insight into the upcoming enemy. That said, they also occasionally doubled as puzzle solutions and helped tie together the overall narrative, which made the hunt for them especially rewarding. With all this said, I suppose this is as good a time as any to dive into both what Anima Gate of Memories is, as well as how it plays. Genre-wise, Anima is most heavily identifiable as a combo-oriented brawler, with a large focus on chaining together attacks while evading the enemies. What's more, you alternate between 2 protagonists, able to swap between them on the fly to better chain together combos, different abilities, or even simply to save yourself, as whilst they may share stamina, they both have separate health bars. Whilst it's an interesting idea in and of itself, it's one that is inherently tied to the game's RPG elements, as you'll find yourself needing to level up and slowly fill the character's move list to earn more than the basic amount of moves you begin with. In fact, the characters don't actually feel all that different at first due to the overlap in their basic skills, and it wasn't until well into the mid-game that they really started to feel distinct in their combat roles. Though, on that front, it was nice that you could essentially build one character to be a magic-oriented blaster and the other to be a physically-oriented bruiser, and the gear system certainly allows you to complement that. Which, to be fair, there is quite a bit of gear that you get to tinker around with, the likes of which generally provide stats, but can also offer up some really nifty passive abilities like increased defense or stamina regeneration. That said, it doesn't stop the fact that the combat still ends up feeling vexsome as I progress through the game. Part of the problem is simply the balancing, as there's a number of enemies which are incredibly gimmicky, and whom dealing with tended to revolve on some incredibly cheap tactics on my part to expedite the fights. Especially given that even when I was a decently high level, they seemed to have the capacity to empty my health in 2 to 3 hits, making some of the later encounters harrowing games of keep away, or just chaining stunlocks and praying my stamina would hold out. But it actually got worse in the face of projectile spam that began to crop up in later fights, especially in tandem with the enemy's ability to shoot you in the back even when you weren't able to see them, and a growing number of range spamming minions to contend with. Peak game-oriented malice came, however, with the later bosses, which took a lot of these elements and combined them to make absolutely grotesque and cheap-feeling segments, which would seem right at home in a Toho game. Which covers my issues with the combat, but it doesn't just stop there. See, Anima also includes a fair amount of puzzle solving, exploration, and platforming. Some of this is handled relatively well, like finding solutions to riddles, using items in certain spots, or just discovering neat nooks and crannies in various stages, but I could never get over just how unpleasant the jumping was in this game. I could feel my blood pressure rising whenever I hopped and found myself unable to properly gauge the distance when I was making a leap, or the camera angle changed mid-leap, and just complicated my skyward ascent. Even without those factors, the actual process of precision platforming felt like pulling teeth, as some were a bit finicky, with at least a few having hazards and also being time segments. And perhaps the worst injury to insult wasn't the damage taken when you fell, but the fact that it sent you hurtling back to the start of the platforming segment, especially given how lengthy some are. And odds are that you will find yourself engaging in these, because some of them are optional, but a number of them you'll need to complete in order to advance the level or find the memory cores needed to confront the game's various bosses. And there's certainly a number of useful pieces of equipment at the end of them to boot. Perhaps just for this reason, I wasn't overly keen on engaging the game's offer of New Game Plus, as whilst it does provide the player the chance of seeing a pair of new endings, those are thankfully tacked on right near the beginning of the game, meaning that beyond that, I was simply going to be subjugating myself to the same things I had earlier, albeit with a higher level and the overall damage for enemies being upped. And yes, there is 3 other endings you could pursue over the course of the main campaign, but given that the game made autosaves right before the point of no return each time I pursued one, it actually made the ability to simply reload and proceed from there pleasantly accessible, and thus enabled me to avoid repeating the entirety of the campaign. But you know, let's change the subject. Let's dive into its presentation, shall we? On a visual level, Gate of Memories is fairly nice, with a fair number of environments to traverse, all of which have their own thematic enemies. Sure, some feel a bit sparse in their design, such as in the area of folklore, but others, like the Mansion of Dolls, give off an almost early Resident Evil vibe, and combat does manage to look good, especially as you unlock later skills, allowing you to chain together some neat-looking abilities. That said, I did find some of the game's cutscenes notably janky, if only because they tend to freeze the characters in certain poses, which especially classes in the face of the animated backgrounds. I imagine it's done to save on animations, but it's fairly noticeable, especially when the characters use idle frames during normal conversations. What I really want to talk about, however, is the sound design. Because, on one hand, it actually has a really nice soundtrack that manages to make the game sound incredibly epic in some moments. And the sound effects are generally alright. But, you know, then there's some absolutely hammy voice acting. Okay, maybe not uniformly hammy, given that the protagonist sounds like she has more trouble expressing herself than a mute opera singer, but the secondary protagonist, Ergo Mundus, makes up for it in spades. And the weird thing is, I was stuck between hating some of the lines, in part due to the writing, to cracking up laughing because of the over-the-top delivery. There's some definite moments where you get a quality bit of threatening dialogue, or a genuinely intimidating evil laugh out of Ergo, and then he flips the script and goes to like a completely hammy bit of comic relief, and sometimes it's comedy gold, and other times it's a bit jarring. Anyways, so this is the end of the video, and this is a weird one, because I acknowledge that Anima Gate of Memories is a bit clunky and rough around the edges, and yet I still found myself charmed by it. That's not to say I'd recommend it to most people, since its platforming, combat difficulty, and overall balance leaves a fair bit to be desired, but it was an experience I still found myself enjoying most of the time. Some of it I think is just the weird tone of the game, as whilst the writing and voicing literally had me cringing at times, there were other moments it managed to genuinely interest me, or simply have me simultaneously laughing and rolling my eyes at a terrible joke that just been so bad it transcended into being funny. Ultimately, I'd say Anima is a very good example of a fumble, as it's an imperfect mess of a game, and yet I feel that for someone looking for a cheesy anime-infused adventure that has a sort of B-movie quality, this might actually itch their scratch. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And for those interested in more indie reviews, developer interviews, or our Monday TTRPG content, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know when there's a new release. There's also a Discord. You can click the link in the banner or the description to become a part of our community, the Crit Hit Cauldron. Lastly, if you'd like to help support the channel, we do have a coffee running now to help supplement funds for our lovely editor, and to make sure we can continue to provide quality content. Again, check the description and the banner for them links. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.